A warm welcome to everyone to the anesthesia class. The topic for today is capnography. See, capnography is a very important topic because these days how the questions are being framed on capnography is like certain case scenarios are given and a capnogram is given to you to relate the case scenario with the capnograph with a further extension to this to let them know the management of that case according to the capnograph or the capnogram that has been given to you. See, these case scenarios are individual case scenarios, and before going to the different types of capnograph, it is very important to have some basic knowledge about carbon dioxide and a normal capnograph. After that, we'll go to different kinds of capnographs, followed by a brief discussion about the various cases that are associated with it. Plus, all the cases will be discussed in detail in the further classes, which would be the systems and the anesthesia effects on the various systems and the diseases. So let's start with the capnography. See, when we are talking about capnography, it will be dealt with the history, the terms, why is it important, the physics, the types, a basic physiology, components of normal capnography, clinical applications of it. See, when we talk about the history of capnograph, the first thing that we all have to understand, see, oxygen is the gas of life. We all understand that. But most importantly to know is that carbon dioxide is the proof of life. Yes, if asked which gas is known as the gas of proof of life, it is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a mandatory monitor in the form of N-tidal CO2. Actually, it is a mandatory monitor when we talk about the American Society of Anesthesiologists standards, and when we talk about the Indian Society of Anesthesiologists standard, it is still a desirable monitor. It is non-invasive, and when we talk about the capnogram, it is nothing but a graphical representation of the continuous display of N-tidal CO2 versus time during inspiration as well as during expiration. Please remember this thing that when we talk about capnograph, time versus EtCO2, it is not only during expiration, it is during inspiration as well as the expiration. And EtCO2 per se is the best reflection of our alveolar CO2. I repeat, EtCO2, N-tidal CO2 is the best reflection of the alveolar carbon dioxide. And yes, majorly we take it that our arterial carbon dioxide is also more or less equal to our N-tidal carbon dioxide. So I want you all not to get confused with these three terms. One is with small a, that is arterial carbon dioxide, a capital A, that is alveolar carbon dioxide, and EtCO2, that is N-tidal carbon dioxide. The difference between PaCO2 and EtCO2 is only 0 to 5 millimeters of mercury under normal circumstances. Okay, because this gradient also let us know about various disorders of the lung and at the level of the tissue, which will be coming forward. Talking about the history of capnography, only one thing is very important for you is that who actually developed this monitor, and it was Luft who first developed this monitor, and Holland was the first country to make it mandatory monitor. Coming over to certain terminologies which are associated with it. See, when we talk about the capnography, there are two things it compromises of. One is the graph and the other is the numerical value. One is this graph that is known as the capnogram or the capnograph, which is the continuous concentration versus time display. Second is the numerical value of the capnograph, and this is known as the capnometry, that is the measured CO2. And the device which is used to measure CO2 is known as capnometer. A capnography is the graphical representation of this. This whole is capnography. The graph that comes is capnogram. The numerical value is the capnometry, and the instrument which is required for the same is capnometer. Now, coming forward to what actually is CO2 transport and how CO2 is transported in our body. In the previous classes, I have told you about two effects. One is the Bohr effect and other is the Haldane effect. See, when we talk about the Bohr effect, you all know that CO2 is being produced in our tissues, right? See, when tissue CO2 is produced in the tissues because of the cell metabolism, it goes to the RBCs because of the concentration gradient which is present. As soon as it enters RBCs, we have water in this. And with the help of one enzyme, which is the carbonic anhydrase, it gets converted into H2CO3 and hemoglobin, oxygenated hemoglobin, which is present at the level of the tissues, there, because of the presence of H positive ions, undergoes a rightward shift of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. I hope you all remember that metabolic acidosis, presence of H positive, and increase in CO2 levels lead to rightward shift of the oxygen hemoglobin curve, which leads to dissociation of oxygen from the hemoglobin and addition of H positive to the hemoglobin. And eventually we have H positive hemoglobin that is carried to our pulmonary capillaries to be converted back into CO2 plus H2O2 under the influence of the same enzyme, that is the carbonic anhydrase, and eventually this CO2 that is formed under the concentration gradient gets expired through our alveolus and our respiratory tract back into the atmosphere. And this effect is known as the Haldane effect, which is just the opposite of the Bohr effect that is occurring at the tissue level, and Haldane effect is occurring at the level of lungs. One more important thing which is happening here is the movement of two anions, that are the bicarbs and the chlorides. Please see, because the concentration of bicarbs increase here, so it moves out at the tissue level and the chloride moves in, whereas it is the opposite that happens in the lungs, where the bicarbs will move in, they will combine with H positive, and oxygen will then combine with our hemoglobin, and eventually oxyhemoglobin will be carried in the capillaries back to the tissues, and they both will combine to form carbonic acid, which will get dissociated under the effects of carbonic anhydrase, and this dissociated form of CO2 will then be expelled or expired out of our body. These are Bohr effect at the level of tissues, that is BT, and Haldane effect HL at the level of lungs. This is something which is must to know, that the movement of two ions take place, bicarbs and chloride. Bohr effect at the level of the tissues, where oxyhemoglobin gets dissociated because of the rightward shift and it carries H positive with it, whereas at the level of the lungs it is just the opposite that is happening. Now, what is actually the working principle of the capnography? When we talk about the capnography, it has two types. One is the infrared spectrophotometry, which is the most commonly used. Other is the colorimetric analyzer. When we talk about the colorimetric analyzer, we have a litmus paper which is purple in color. And when expiration occurs and CO2 gets onto this litmus paper, the color changes from tan and eventually to yellow, depending upon the concentration of the carbon dioxide. And when we talk about the infrared spectrophotometry method, it is very same to what we have studied in pulse oximeter. It also depends upon the same law, that is the Lambert-Beer's law, as it was observed that CO2 also absorbs a specific kind of wavelength of length 4.26 micrometers. This infrared rays are they are given, and the CO2 will absorb this 4.26 micrometers of wavelength, and the left one will be transmitted, and eventually it will be analyzed, and using certain algorithms we are going to have a capnograph which will be displayed on our monitors. The thing that has to be remembered is the principle is infrared spectrophotometry. The law that is used, Lambert-Beer's law. Lambert-Beer law said the absorbance is directly proportional to the solute, that is the concentration that is present, and also to the length or the distance that is traversed by the infrared rays. They are directly proportional to the concentration of the CO2 plus the distance that has been covered. And the wavelength. The wavelength that CO2 absorbs is 4.26 micrometer. And eventually we'll have that capnograph display on our monitors. Now, what are the uses of this capnography? Why is it so important? See, I have already told you that CO2 is also known as the proof of life. So, CO2, just by measuring or looking at the graphical representation, we can come to know about three main functions of our body. What are these three main functions? One is the metabolism, because through metabolism, we can come to know how much CO2 is being produced. If we have excess of CO2, it means the body is in hypermetabolic state. And if we have decreased CO2, it means we are in hypometabolic state. And thus, it can ring our bells to know the correct diagnosis of the patient. Second, circulation. As I've already told, that CO2 is eventually carried in the blood to the alveoli, and there the exchange takes place, and finally the CO2 is expired. Now, because it is being carried in the blood, then obviously the circulation, the perfusion of the tissues, the cardiac output, everything is going to change the level of the CO2 that is being expired in the respiratory gases. For example, if we have hypoperfusion, that is we are in a shock state, or we have a V by Q mismatch, perfusion and ventilation mismatch at the level of the lungs, then eventually, because of the compromised circulation, the EtCO2 that will be produced will also be compromised. And lastly, it tells us about the ventilation, that is the exchange of the gases which are taking place at the level of the parenchyma of the lungs. So finally, as you can see, that CO2, just one graph and one numerical value can tell you about three main functions of our system, of our body, which will be like diagnosing and helping in diagnose one of the most life-threatening disorders also. That is, we can know about our metabolism, we can know about our circulation, and eventually we can know about the ventilation. Thus, it can help in diagnosing various conditions like venous embolisms, malignant hyperthermias, bronchospasms, complete, partial, etc. We'll be coming to one by one of all these disorders that how the capnograph are going to look at. Lastly, it also helps us in monitoring the performance of the chest compression during CPR. Then it can help in diagnosing certain life-threatening, devastating situations like circuit disconnection. Suppose the patient is under controlled ventilation and just imagine the circuit gets disconnected and patient is no longer having a supply of oxygen. Or the soda lime. See, soda lime is an absorbent, and if it gets exhausted, the EtCO2 or the PaCO2 levels in our body will be highly raised. So it helps in diagnosing all these conditions. And most importantly, ATCO2, please remember this line very carefully. It is the gold standard for endotracheal tube placement because we assume that there is only one place from which CO2 is being exhaled, and that is our respiratory tract. So if endotracheal tube placement is in the right position at the correct place, then your E2CO2 graph will be normal. And then it can help us during our anesthesia. It can be any kind of anesthesia, maybe regional, general anesthesia, and even monitored anesthesia care. Capnography is of utmost importance. And lastly, in ICU monitoring, for example, in a patient of respiratory failure or in a patient of ARDS, it does have prognostic potential to tell whether the patient is improving or the patient is deteriorating. So these are the main uses of capnography. Now coming over to what are the advantages of this capnograph. See, when we compare this capnograph, the pulse oximeter, as we've already studied, the pulse oximeter is affected by motions or dysarrhythmias, or it is very well affected by poor perfusion. That is, if there is poor perfusion, we are not going to get a plethysmographic waveform. Whereas if there is a poor perfusion, EtCO2 does come and it helps us in knowing that yes, there is a poor perfusion. And motion artifacts and dysarrhythmias does not affect our capnographic wave. Then secondly, it has very less delay. The delay in the changes that are seen in EtCO2 are less than 10 seconds, and eventually it actually comes just in 5 seconds. Whereas if you remember the sigmoid curve of the plethysmographic wave, this was the sigmoid curve about the PaO2 versus our saturation of hemoglobin. If you remember this curve, that the beauty of this curve was that maybe the PaO2 is falling very speedily, but the saturation does not fall at the same speed. So we have a delay in diagnosing the respiratory events, whereas this does not happen in CO2. Next, we come over to what kind of sensors do we have in capnography. See, when we talk about these sensors, mostly questions don't come from the type of sensors or the details about the sensors. I'll be dealing with the sensors in very briefly. There are broadly two types of sensors we have. One are the mainstream sensors. As the name suggests, it will be connected between your, suppose this is your patient, this is your patient, and the patient is intubated. This is your endotracheal tube, and this is your ventilator, and this is your circuit, and your air or the inspired oxygen, your anesthetic gases are coming over from here. This is the mainstream sensor which lies between the endotracheal tube and your expired limb of the circuit. The advantage of such a sensor is that there is no sampling tube, there is no, the obstruction is not there, moisture is not there, it is very less pollutant, and there is no delay in recording the EtCO2 values. Whereas when we talk about the disadvantages, very much visible is that it's quite heavy. right? The weight of the sensor could be problematic, especially in pediatric population. Then it is not suitable if the patient is not supine. If the patient is prone lateral, then it can lead to problems. And eventually, such a sensor cannot be used in non-intubated patient. The prerequisite for using the mainstream sensor is that the patient has to be intubated. If the patient is intubated, then only this mainstream sensor can be connected to the endotracheal tube. And lastly, this can be clogged with the secretions of the patient because it is in direct contact with the endotracheal tube and thus the respiratory tract of the patient. The next is the side stream sensor. See, the side stream sensor is this is the sampling adapter. This is the patient. The patient has in situ endotracheal tube. This is the ventilator and this is the circuit. And this is only sampling adapter through which we have a sampling tube and its expired gas, a sample of the expired gas moves through the sampling tube to the side stream sensor. This is the sensor and eventually the sensor is connected to the monitor and a capnographic wave comes. The advantage of such is it is easy to connect. It can be used in any position and even in non-intubated patients. So it is very, very useful in regional anesthesia and monitored anesthesia care because this can be used in awake patients. And the issue with sterilization is quite less as compared to the mainstream sensor. But the disadvantages quite visible. We can have moisture obstruction or pressure drop effects when there is a sampling tube. And obviously, there is some delay in recording as compared to mainstream capnography sensors. Now, talking just four lines about one of the most important gases we have, that is the carbon dioxide. I want you all to remember one thing, please, that when we breathe because of the hypercarbic drive. It is not hypoxic drive. We have a hypoxic drive only when the PaO2 has fallen very, very low. And in normal patients, in normal individuals, it is hypercarbia that makes us respire. It's not actually CO2, but CO2 is just a surrogate marker. It is actually H positive that will go to the chemoreceptors which are present in the respiratory zone in the medulla, activated and tell our body, take a breath, take a breath. So we have a hypercarbic drive. CO2 is generally found in the liquid form. It has a gray colored cylinder. Oxygen had a black cylinder with white shoulders, white and black, whereas the carbon dioxide has a gray cylinder. Okay. The critical temperature, when we talk about carbon dioxide, has a critical temperature of 31 degrees Celsius. That is why it is present generally in a liquid form. The pressure in the cylinders is 45 to 46 bars. We can remember it like 45 bars is the pressure of the CO2 in the cylinder. And one important form of CO2 that is present is solid ice. That is, dry ice is actually CO2. Yes. And it is formed at a temperature of minus 78.5 degrees Celsius. Yeah, I know it is a bit annoying when it comes to all these numerical values, but there are certain values that you all have to remember. Can't help that. So the critical temperature of CO2 is 31 degrees Celsius. The pressure of CO2 in the cylinders is around 45 to 46 bars, and dry ice that is formed is minus 78.5 degree Celsius. Now coming to what a normal capnograph looks like. Now let's revisit how the CO2 is being expired from our respiratory tract. So the first thing that will be expiring would be the conducting zone gases, right? The gas that is present in the conducting zone, which would be the dead space gases, where no exchange of the gases is taking place. So such place has no CO2. The very first phase that you can see is the baseline, the respiratory baseline phase, that is the 0 mmHg of CO2, which is the phase 1. Now second, after the dead space, we have a mixture of the dead space gases, plus now we are in the zone of where exchange is taking place or ventilation is taking place. That is, our alveoli are present. So we have a dead space plus CO2 is now being expired at the level of alveoli. So we have a expiratory upstroke as phase 2. The phase 2 is expiratory upstroke because of the presence of CO2 within the dead space, which is 0, plus the alveolar CO2, which is now being added to it. That is your phase 2. Now phase 3 has a slightly upstroke, and finally there is a plateau, that is all the alveoli are emptying. More or less we take it that all the alveoli empty at the same rate and the same space. Obviously there is certain physiological shuntings that are present, but eventually it is all the alveoli that is emptying. That is your phase 3, which is the alveoli plateau. The end of this phase 3, when the phase 3 is finishing, this point, that is the highest measurement of CO2, is known as your end tidal CO2, which comes in the numerical forms also. And the normal value of EtCO2 is 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury. And eventually we have phase 4, which is the inspiratory phase, in which we have a downstroke, and finally our graph touches the baseline again, and this again is formed with every breath. And when we talk about whether the patient has a normal capnograph, please look at least for 4 normal capnographs before diagnosing any condition. Please look at, I repeat, 4 normal capnographic waveforms before you diagnose any condition. So these are 1, 2, 3, 4, dead space plus the alveoli. The alveoli are emptying in phase 3, and eventually we have a downslope because of the inspiration that is occurring, in which the EtCO2 will eventually touch the baseline. I'm repeating this again and again because if you know the normal capnograph, then you can easily correlate it with the abnormal capnographs. Now, when we talk about the capnographs and how we actually have to study those capnographs, the first thing when a capnographic waveform comes in front of you is, please see if the capnographic wave is present or it has disappeared. Like this, there is no capnographic wave. First, one normal capnographic wave came, and then eventually there is disappearance of the capnographic wave. Now, which are the conditions in which such a disappearance will occur? Something that the EtCO2 is not coming out of the body, either one, or second, there is certain problems with our technique or with the measurement, that our EtCO2 sensors are not being able to measure that EtCO2 which is being produced. So the first thing would be like circuit disconnection, which is the most common reason why a CO2 waveform suddenly goes. That is, your circuit has been disconnected. So the sensors are disconnected from the ET tube and it is no longer taking your EtCO2. circuit has been disconnected. Second, your ET tube has been malpositioned. I've already told you, we assume that CO2 comes only from a respiratory tract. So if your endotracheal tube is not in the trachea or the respiratory tract, obviously the CO2 waveform will disappear. Then one person can have a cardiac arrest. As soon as there is a cardiac arrest, there is no cardiac output, there is no perfusion in the body, and eventually no EtCO2 will be produced. There is a stoppage of ventilation. Stoppage of ventilation, ventilator has failed. The ventilator, which was delivering oxygen or the respiratory gases to the patient, has actually suddenly stopped, and there is no ventilation to the patient. And this will actually lead to no EtCO2 because there is no exchange of gases. And lastly, we can have a massive pulmonary embolism. See, please remember one thing. What I am talking about is sudden disappearance of the EtCO2 wave. The whole EtCO2 wave has disappeared and there is no graphs that are coming. And that can happen only in cases of something which is quite massive that is happening. Like, for example, the whole circuit has got disconnected, the ventilator has stopped, the patient has undergone a cardiac arrest, or lastly, we have a massive pulmonary embolism because of which there is no exchange of gases. The pulmonary capillaries are all blocked and we have no exchange, we have only dead space that is left. And lastly, we can have malposition of ET tube, that is the ET tube has got dislodged. So all these conditions where either metabolism, ventilation or circulation has been compromised to a very extreme part. In that case, we have no CO2 waveform that is present. Disappearance of the CO2 waveform is there. That is the first condition. And this comes in the clinical scenarios like sudden. There has been a sudden disappearance of the EtCO2 curve. So what could be the reason out of these four? Next scenario that comes is esophageal intubation. In this, the scene can come like, for example, a newly trained anesthesiologist has attempted an intubation, and after the intubation, this is the kind of EtCO2 curve that we are getting. This curve is suggestive of esophageal intubation because, as you can see, it's not a normal capnograph. Let's compare it with a normal capnograph. A normal capnograph is like this. It's rectangular in shape, right? This is a normal capnograph. This is just a one capnographic curve which is coming because of some CO2 that is produced in stomach, and eventually after 3 to 4 such waves, it will be a disappearance of the waves that will be seen. This is suggestive of esophageal intubation, and the reason that why some CO2 waves can come is if the patient had certain aerated drinks before coming to the hospital. The bacterial flora in the stomach also produces some CO2 which can be seen in this form. And lastly, it could be iatrogenic, that during the mask bag and the mask ventilation that we were doing prior to intubation, some CO2 had gone in the through esophagus into the stomach, and now that is coming out. Esophageal intubation is per se a life threatening condition. Okay, so the next thing that comes is if such kind of capnograph is coming, so what you have to do? You have to be very quick enough to diagnose this condition, and this condition could be diagnosed not only with the help of capnograph, but it can be supported by chest rise. There will be no chest rise and auscultation. See, if it comes that which is the gold standard for diagnosing the esophageal intubation, it is EtCO2, that is capnography, because I've already told you that pulse oximetry will take time. it will be like around 3 to 4 minutes before the saturation actually starts falling very fast. So the gold standard for the diagnosis of esophageal intubation would be nothing but EtCO2 graph, and eventually if there is the EtCO2 graph comes like this, there is no chest rise, there is no sounds on auscultation, the dictum is take the tube out and take the patient on bag and mask ventilation. This is the management. Take the tube out, reinsert it, and before that do bag and mask ventilation of the patient. This is the second case scenario. Now talking about the third case scenario is a cardiac arrest. Suppose a normal capnograph was going. We had a normal capnograph and suddenly we had a straight line which could be suggestive of a cardiac arrest. Obviously, when we're talking about cardiac arrest, there would be other vital parameters also which will be changing, like your pulse will be absent, there will be a marked hypoperfusion or hypotension in the patient. It is suggestive of cardiac arrest. Now, how does EtCO2 helps us? It helps us when we are giving the chest compressions. Yeah, the quality of the chest compressions can be judged by looking at the EtCO2. It is said that EtCO2 levels of 10 millimeters of mercury are must for adequate chest compressions. And eventually, when you are giving the chest compressions and suddenly the EtCO2 rises from 10 millimeters of mercury to 35 millimeters of mercury, this is indicative of return of spontaneous circulation. I repeat, it tells us about the prognostication of the quality of a chest compressions, and the minimum amount of EtCO2 that has to be shown on the monitor is 10 millimeters of mercury, and if suddenly the EtCO2 rises to 35 millimeters of mercury, we can be sure of that it is the return of spontaneous circulation. Now moving forward, the next is the rebreathing part. See, look at the baseline. Now look at this baseline. As I've already told you that eventually when the inspiratory stroke, downstroke, it always has to touch the baseline. Now in this, it's not touching the baseline, which means that is some amount of carbon dioxide is being produced or is being added to our inspired gases also, which is known as the rebreathing. So if the EtCO2 curve that has been given is not touching the baseline, this is suggestive of rebreathing. Now the cases can come, for example, exhaustion of soda lime. That the soda lime canister, which was first white in color, it has now changed completely in pink color, and this is the capnograph that is coming. So this is suggestive of what, and what should be the management? This is suggestive of that the whole of the soda lime has been exhausted and now we have to change the soda lime eventually. The reasons for this rebreathing could be many more. One, the most common, exhaustion of soda lime. The second case that can come is, these days, one of the techniques of anesthesia which are quite famous is low flow anesthesia. So, it can be suggested that the patient is undergoing low flow anesthesia and this kind of capnograph is coming. So, what should be done? If this is coming, which means there is rebreathing and the fresh gas flow that you are giving to the patient is inadequate, and thus we have to increase our fresh gas flow if the patient is undergoing low flow anesthesia. Then we can have certain problems in the expiratory valves. The expiratory valve malfunction can lead to rebreathing, and eventually if the expiratory time is inadequate and the CO2 is not being able to wash out of a body proportionately as compared to the time that is being given, then eventually some amount of CO2 will be present in our inspired gas also. Out of this, the most common two scenarios are the soda line has got exhausted or the fresh gas flow that we are taking place is inadequate. So please look for certain hints in the question. For example, the color of the soda line or the patient is undergoing low flow anesthesia. So the next scene that comes is expiratory upstrokes. See, this is a normal capnograph, and if you compare this with this, we have a upstroke of phase 3. This is phase 3, and this is in comparison to a shark fin, if you can see. Yeah, this is like a shark fin. So this kind of capnograph is also known as a shark fin pattern of capnograph. See what it is suggestive of. The phase 3 that we have already told about is the phase of alveoli. The alveoli are emptying, and these are those conditions in which very, very slowly the alveoli are emptying. So we can have a very steep phase 3. In these conditions, one thing that increases is your this angle. This angle between your phase 2 and phase 3 is the alpha angle, which is normally 195 to 110 degrees. So this angle increases if there is an obstruction and the alveoli are emptying very, very slowly. But eventually they will empty, but they're emptying slowly. Such condition comes in obstructive pathologies like COPDs, asthmas, partial obstruction and bronchospasm. Because if there is complete obstruction or complete bronchospasm, then eventually EtCO2 graph will not be present. Okay. So if there is any obstructive pathology, then we will have a shark fin pattern which is suggestive of delay in the alveoli emptying with increase in our alpha angle. One thing that I've forgotten in the previous slide is in rebreathing, this angle will change. And this angle is suggestive of beta angle, which is 90 to 95 degrees. This angle changes in rebreathing. It increases in rebreathing, whereas alpha angle increases in obstructive pathologies. Okay. Now moving forward to the next is a pigtail capnograph. See this upstroke that you can see? This upstroke is coming at just the end of phase 3. And this little upstroke is suggestive of a poorly compliant lung. So the condition or the case that will come is, for example, the patient can have a poor lung compliance in certain condition, like the case scenario could be of obesity, a pregnancy, or lastly, the sampling tube could have a leak or a slit, because of which some amount of inspired air has gone into the sampling tube. In that case also we can have such a upstroke of last phase of the in the last part of the phase 3. So there are 3 conditions in which we can have this pigtail capnograph. A poorly lung compliance, which can be seen in obesity and pregnancy. Okay, that's the most common ones. And lastly, if the sampling tube has a slit, because of which there is ingress of the inspired gases, in that case also we can have this kind of pigtail capnograph. Moving forward, to one of the most commonly given capnographs, which is the curare cleft. This is the curare cleft. If you remember what is curare, yeah, curare name has been suggestive of the first skeletal muscle relaxant that was discovered, that is tubocurarine. That was the first skeletal muscle relaxant. So this curare cleft that generally comes in the later part of your phase 3 is suggestive of two things. One, there is an incoordination between the patient breath and the ventilator who is delivering the breath. And secondly, this is like EtCO2 has decreased because of spontaneous breathing by the patient. The curare cleft comes when during the controlled ventilation, your skeletal muscle relaxant have weaned off and the patient has started taking his spontaneous breath. This is curare cleft. And if such a cleft is coming, then what you have to do? Simple. You have to give more skeletal muscle relaxant to the patient and relax him if the surgery is still left. So curare cleft is suggestive of a spontaneous breathing by the patient leading to incoordination between the patient breath and the ventilator. Moving to the next, these are certain very typical or very unique capnographs, which yes, they are not very important or they don't come routinely, but as you know, we have to be prepared for certain types, certain questions which could be like we can just imagine or futuristic. Some explanations have to be given for certain upcoming kinds of questions, because till now whatever capnographs I have told you have already been, they have already come in the previous year's questions. So there will be certain capnographs that I just want to add as potential questions which can come. One of them is a dual hump capnograph. That is the dual hump like a camel hump which has two upstrokes during the phase 3. See, when there is a biphasic upstroke, you can well imagine that there is some discoordination between the two lungs. That is why these two humps are coming. So one of the main reasons for these two humps is your lung transplant. That the one lung is not very happy with the other lung because that's foreign, and thus we have two humps in the phase 3 of alveoli. And two other conditions in which these are coming are severe kyphoscoliosis. Again, in severe kyphoscoliosis, please remember this, we have a restrictive pattern of respiration and one lung is not coordinating with the other lung. That is why we have two humps. The same goes with the third condition, that is the endobronchial intubation that occurs. Of course, endobronchial means your tracheal tube is in one bronchus and thus again the two lungs are not coordinating with each other and we have a biphasic or a dual hump capnograph. Now moving to next scene, that is the downward sloping of phase 3. Generally till now we have seen an upward stroke or a pigtail or a curare cleft, and now we have certain downward if this phase 3 has been there. In the downward slope, the case that will be coming to you will be of that something has happened to your alveolar membrane. The alveoli and the capillary basement membrane that was used for the exchange of the gases. Something when happens to that parenchyma damage, then generally we have this kind of capnograph which can be suggestive of certain conditions like emphysema. Like emphysema, we have a downward slope of phase 3, suggestive of the destruction of the alveolar membrane and thus decreased gaseous exchange. Next, one of the most important and commonly asked is cardiogenic oscillations, or this is also known by one more effect, that is the ripple effect. See, this is physiological, not actually pathological, and this generally happens in pediatric patients because of the less distance of the heart and your skin or your EtCO2. Your heart or your lung actually they're very close to each other because of very less fat of the subcutaneous tissue that is present, and because of which the cardiogenic oscillations can be actually seen in the EtCO2, and this are your heart rate actually. Yeah, this is the movement of the heart that is captured in the ATCO2, generally taking place in pediatrics or very lean and thin patients, also known as the ripple effect. Moving forward, in one of the most potential type of questions, this is when the inspiratory stroke, this is your inspiratory stroke, as you all can see, this slope. Now this inspiratory slope is a little extended. It's it's taking time actually. This is because of the incompetent inspiratory valve. We had studied about the expiratory valve which was incompetent, and because of which we had that phase 3 which was a little, yeah, it was having an upstroke and a delay of emptying. The same happens with the inspiratory phase when we have a inspiratory unidirectional valve which is incompetent in nature. Moving forward with one of the last conditions, that is when you don't have a perfect EtCO2 curve but still the capnograph is coming. The capnograph is coming but it is not coming like it should come. So what could be the reason for this? One of the most common reason for this is that your EtCO2 is getting leaked. Your EtCO2 is getting leaked, because of which less amount of EtCO2 is being sampled, and thus the EtCO2 is not like a normal curve, which can happen if your endotracheal tube is not adequately sealed. If the cuff of the endotracheal tube is leaking, then we can have such kind of capnographic waveforms. Now, some scenarios that actually come is like they will give such a capnograph and it will be shown that suddenly there has been a sudden increase in the height of the capnograph. Now, what could be the reason for sudden the capnograph has shot so much? One most important reason that comes is malignant hyperthermias, in which we can have double or triple of the baseline of the EtCO2. Malignant hyperthermias are a like of are kind of hypermetabolic state of a body because of problems in one of the receptors of calcium, which are iodine receptors. Okay, there's a problem in the calcium metabolism because of which we have a hypermetabolic state known as malignant hyperthermia. This is one of the most important genetically inherited condition of anesthesia which could be devastating also. And in this, the patient has a very high grade fever, the patient has an increase in EtCO2, and the suggestive hints in the question that would be that such patients have a history that they were given scoline or any halogenated agents just before the intubation or just before this EtCO2 curve was had such a high peak. So the hints that will be coming in your question would be like the patient had a sudden change in the capnograph, which is suggestive of such a kind of capnograph that is coming, and the patient was given scoline or was given halothane or any other halogenated agent. And now this is suggestive of a condition known as malignant hyperthermia, because both of these agents predispose the patient to such a condition. And when such condition comes, what is the treatment? First, cooling, because there is very high grade fever. A fever of around 105 to 106 can be touched. So cooling has to be done, followed by a medicine known as Dentrolin, which is the antidote of choice for such a condition of malignant hyperthermia. This is the maximum that you all have to know about malignant hyperthermia, that the most causative agent for that is choline and halogenated compounds. And it is actually not the fever that comes first. It is the ETCO2 that is going to rise suddenly. Cooling has to be done and dentrolin injection has to be provided. And the pathophysiology of malignant hyperthermia is ryanodine receptors which are not functioning properly, and they are responsible for the calcium metabolism. So this is one of the conditions. Other conditions could be anything that is leading to hypermetabolism in the body, like fever. It will lead to increase in ETCO2, shivering, thyrotoxicosis, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, seizures or convulsions, and lastly, one more important thing that is especially in the orthopedic case scenarios is release of the tourniquet. When the tourniquet is released, there is a sudden increase in ETCO2 which can be observed. And lastly, one thing that you have to see is hypoventilation. See, if your case scenario is suggestive of such and they have given you the respiratory parameters, yeah, if they have given you the tidal volume or they have given you the respiratory rate, so please look at them. If the patient is having a less respiratory rate or a less tidal volume leading to hypoventilation, that can also lead to increase in ETCO2. But that increase in ETCO2 would be a bit less sudden in comparison to other hypermetabolic state. That is the only difference. That if the patient is hypoventilating, there would be increase in ETCO2, but slowly and steadily. But in certain conditions like malignant hyperthermias, there will be a sudden increase in ETCO2. And if the patient is hypoventilating, then your management would be, yeah, very simple. You have to change the tidal volume or you have to increase the respiratory rate. Moving forward to just the opposite of the sudden increase in ETCO2, that is the decrease in ETCO2. Now, the decrease in ETCO2, just the vice versa, anything that is leading to hypometabolism. It could be hypothermias, the anesthesia per se, hypothyroidism, or any state leading to hypoperfusion. I have already told you that circulation is something that brings your CO2 from your tissues to your lung. So if that is compromised, that eventually your ETCO2 is going to decrease. Now this decrease in ETCO2 could be sudden or it could be slow and steady. If it is slow and steady, this means the patient is going under hypotension slowly and steadily. But if it is sudden change in ETCO2 or sudden decrease in ETCO2, the first condition which is highly suggestive of this is embolism. Please remember, the case scenarios will definitely hint you to the condition of embolism. For example, the case could be a posterior fossa surgery, that is a neurosurgery is taking place, and neurosurgeries are very prone for venous air embolism leading to a sudden decrease of ETCO2. And then the management will come. The management of these cases will be discussed in details in neuroanesthesia. But still, to complete the discussion, I'll just let you know that the management of air embolism would be first the diagnosis of venous air embolism. The gold standard for that is your transesophageal echocardiography. Please remember that. And clinically, the diagnosis is made with the help of Mill-Wheel's murmur. Okay, these two things you all have to remember when we talk about the venous air embolism and sudden decrease in ETCO2. You have to rule out venous air embolism in posterior fossa or neurosurgeries, especially the surgeries in which your heart is at lower level and your dural sinuses are at higher level, creating that that gradient is created because of which the air can get entrained into that dural sinuses of yours and eventually enter your heart, and there is that air pocket that is formed in your blood circulation, finally leading to a embolic state. So the gold standard is transesophageal echocardiography or Millwheel murmur, and eventually how you have to treat it. First, stop the surgery, of course. Second, you have to fill that place. The whole dural venous sinuses that are exposed, you have to fill that place with normal saline such that you break that pressure gradient between your atmosphere and your opened venous sinuses. And lastly, you have a position known as Durant maneuver, in which we reverse the patient such that the heart comes down, and it is not with the gravity that the air is being entraining into the heart. Or you can always use your central line also to take the air out of your heart. So these are certain maneuvers which are used in order to prevent or actually treat if venous air embolism occurs. And lastly, as there was hypoventilation, if the patient was hypoventilating, there was a gradual increase in EtCO2. And now if the patient is hyperventilating, that is the tidal volume or the respiratory rates are suggestive that it is hyperventilating. So you'll have a decrease in EtCO2. This hyperventilation can come in some other form also. I'll let you know. That is, suppose the patient is a trauma patient or the patient has a brain injury which is suggestive of cerebral edema. Okay. In cerebral edema, what happens is the intracranial pressure actually increases. And to decrease the intracranial pressure, the one parameter that is very important is your carbon dioxide actually. The EtCO2 for such patients have to be kept under the range of 30 millimeters of mercury. Please remember, whenever the patient is undergoing neurosurgery also, the EtCO2 levels have to maintain to 30 millimeters of mercury. The reason? The reason is very simple. See, the CO2 is vasodilatory. Yeah, the CO2 leads to vasodilation in our brains, which can increase the cerebral edema. And thus, the EtCO2 or the CO2 has to be kept at some lower levels, lower of the normal levels, so that the cerebral edema or increase in ICP can be avoided. So, if it is suggestive, the case scenario that the intracranial pressure is increasing, thus we have to hyperventilate the patient, so the RR or the tidal volume of the patient has to be manipulated. But please remember, there is one star question in this, that is the EtCO2 should not be decreased further from 30 millimeters of mercury. I repeat my line, that if the patient is undergoing neurosurgery, you have to keep the EtCO2 till 30 millimeters of mercury, because hyperventilation will help in vasoconstriction and thus will help in decreasing cerebral edema. But you don't have to decrease it till 10 or 15 millimeters of mercury, because at that level the vasoconstriction will be so high that it is going to compromise your cerebral perfusion and actually leading to ischemia of those areas. So please remember, it is not that you're going to decrease the EtCO2 to 10 to 15, because that decrease in EtCO2 is eventually going to lead to compromise of your cerebral perfusion and eventually leading to ischemic injury to your brain. So EtCO2 levels maintain till 30 millimeters of mercury. Higher, no. Low, very low, no. Both extremes are big, no. Coming over to the case scenarios that have actually come in the previous years. One is, I've already discussed actually all of them. A novice attempts of endotracheal intubation for the very first time. Yeah, esophageal intubation. Posterior fossa surgery, suddenly a flat line. Massive venous air embolism can occur. Third is you have given scoline or halogenated compounds, and immediately there is sudden increase in EtCO2, which could be suggestive of malignant hyperthermias. So these were some of the graphs of the EtCO2 that actually comes. So my carrying home message for the capnography would be, yeah, eventually we'll always have a revision chapter or revision lesson for the same, but please, whenever the case scenario comes, kindly read the case scenario very, very carefully, because generally the hint to the answer is given in the case itself. Study the capnogram very patiently to see what the normal capnograph is like, and then correlate it with the abnormal capnograph, that which phase of the capnograph is actually they are talking about. They're talking about the inspiratory baseline, they're talking about the alveolar phase, they're talking about the upstrokes, there is a pigtail, there is a curare cleft, or whatever the abnormality, there is a hyperventilation, that is the EtCO2 is very high, or there is hypoventilation that the EtCO2 levels are high, or hyperventilation that the EtCO2 levels are low. So please correlate it with the normal numerical as well as graphical representation. And lastly, diagnose judiciously and treat accordingly. Thank you.